All right. I think we're good. Surprisingly enough, very minor technical difficulties compared to the recent past. So this is Peretz Moshiach, he who breaks forth. And I'm really tying this off of last week's Parsha. And it's just material that I've wanted to deal with some time now. And normally in last week's Parsha, I've done a couple times in past years teaching that I do now have recorded and up called Light of Mashiach. And it deals with Peretz as well, but in a much different way than I'm going today. Um, there's just a number of things here that there's no coincidence that Hanukkah and the story of Joseph falls the same period every year. And within the Jewish framework, within that mindset, when we look at these things, we're looking at these things as when God set this calendar forth, and he defined the feast days, and he defined Shabbat and the days of the week and all these sorts of things, that even if we say the Parsha are later additions and complete inventions of the rabbis, it was not something that God was oblivious to. Like, oh, surprise, I didn't know these people would do this. And so to believe that even in things, even if someone were to say, well, that was not his intention, blah, blah, blah. There's even things that are not his intention are not without his influence. His hand is still active in them, in those things. Why? Because he is influencing the world to bring it all to a place. And if even in things that are against him, he has no influence over, then we would never reach the ultimate destination that he has for humanity. But when he created this world with a beginning, and he knew the direction it would go, and he created it knowing the ending as well. I mean, he is supreme. He's the creator. There's nothing surprising him. So even when there are those working contrary to him, he is still his influence is still present, moving it towards its ultimate goal. So that being said, even if Parsha are later additions, that what is some of the significance of this time and these stories, and part of that deals with what the temple is really about, is about Moshiach. And the story of Joseph teaches us a lot about Mashiach and our expectations of the Mashiach, and what it means to really be a temple. And so in the teaching I go through, Light of Mashiach is really about teshuvah, repentance, Light of Mashiach, and because really part of Joseph's story is really Judah's story, and that's really important to understand, because through Judah is where the Mashiach comes, through Judah, son of David, and so Judah is actually essential to Joseph's story, and their story is very much intertwined. Judah is pivotal in both Joseph's sale and the restoration. At the conclusion, the culmination is his confrontation with Joseph. And so what you have really, the heart of Light of the Mashiach is, in a nutshell, before moving on, is the transformation of Judah. That's what we have. Joseph is a pretty solid individual through all of his trials, but Judah is not. Judah's beginnings and his endings are not the same. And so, in fact, Judah at his core is transformed by Joseph. And that is the heart of the Mashiach. That's the heart of the Light of Mashiach. And so, that's not necessarily the topic at hand, but I just wanted to preface that way. Because this midrash. So it says, it came to pass at that time, referencing from Genesis 38:1, And this is from Midrash Rabbah, and it says, the sons of Jacob were engaged in selling Joseph. Jacob was taken up with sackcloth and fasting, and Judah was busy taking a wife, while the Holy One, blessed be he, was creating the light of the Messiah. And what does this mean? This is referring to Peretz, born of Judah, and Tamar is the ancestor of King David and the Messiah. So Peretz becomes both the ancestor of King David and therefore Moshiach, and he comes from Judah, where Judah makes a bunch of mess. And Tamar takes it upon her own hands to make it right. Thus Judah exclaims, you are more righteous than I. And from that union, that in some accounts some would say should not even have occurred. Depends on how you look at it. We have Mashiach. Pretty amazing. But what we have within here is the name Peretz, and that's what we want to focus on, the significance of that, right? So elsewhere it says this, and the text is a little small here from those in distance. It says, when she gave birth, there were twins, and he called his name Peretz, and afterwards his brother, and he called his name Zerach, right? Peretz means to break, and Zerach means to shine. Peretz is the direct ancestor of King David and Moshiach. Thus he is identified with Moshiach and already suggested by his name, which alludes to the messianic prophecy of Peretz, the one who breaks through, is gone up before them, from Micah 2:13. That's the thrust of what I'm going to kind of focus on as we go forward. It says, the Midrash therefore notes, before the first enslaver of Israel, i.e. Pharaoh, was born, the ultimate redeemer of Israel, Moshiach, i.e. Peretz, was already born. With the birth of Peretz, our sages note, the Almighty created the light of Mashiach. God thus brought about the remedy and cure before the affliction, that is, before the Egyptian exile and all their exiles that followed thereafter, including our present one. In other words, one of the things that's noted when all this is going on, it's like, where's God? Why is God so silent through these parsha? Why is God allowing Joseph why isn't he? Because he's busy. God is very busy. And it's not like he's too busy to deal with these things. He's busy turning these things to the good. And so, knowing that these actions would lead up to the exile, God was already creating the remedy. Okay? And even though God knew the future exiles, he was already setting in motion a plan that we see culminated in Yeshua. God was already at work. Okay? So, I want to come back to this text, but this is kind of an interesting text. And I chose it not because it's the best example of what I'm going to deal with. It's actually not entirely an example of what I'm going to deal with. But it's really useful for me to make some of the points that I'm going to make. So this is from the King James. I have an altered translation of it I'll go through later. But it says, at this time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered, and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. But he said unto them, have ye not read what David did, and when he was an hungered, and they were with him, how he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say to you that in this place is one greater than the temple. I find this text interesting on a lot of different levels. But simply put, right here, I'll just say that in typical Christianity, this is read, and it's pretty plain. Yeshua's, basically saying, rejecting all their Pharisaical stuff is rubbish. They don't really know what they're talking about. And, you can even take a step further, here again, mainstream Christianity even is, Jesus basically just said the Sabbath day is no big deal, right? I mean, to come to these conclusions, you have to read a lot into this text to come to those kinds of conclusions. Because where within this text does it even say the Sabbath day is no big deal? There's nothing that really says that outright. Let alone, where does Yeshua say, you and your Pharisees are a bunch of idiots, or you don't know anything, or any such thing? It really doesn't. But we're going to come back to this. So this is Micah. And it says, the breaker has come up before them. They have broken up and have passed through the gate and are gone out by it. And their king shall pass before them, and Yahweh on the head of them. That's Micah 2:13. In Judaism, this is seen as a reference to the Mashiach, the reason being here, right here. The root of this is Peretz. It's the same name as the one child there, and the child was named Peretz obviously because he broke first ahead of the other child, Zerach. So he broke forth, and then the shining came afterwards. But on account of the similarity, we interpretively tie this to be a reference to Mashiach, that the word Peretz here, to break through, is used as a hint to who the one that's doing the breaking. So the question is, what is he breaking? It says the breaker has come up before them, they have broken up and have passed through the gate and are gone out by it, and their king shall pass before them. Okay, so the verse prior is talking about a sheep in a sheepfold, right? And here we're talking about a gate and sort of a breaking of something that has a gate, and the direct implication is something to do with a flock. So usually when we're talking about flocks and gates, these things, usually a gate is put in a fence, right? Usually when we have flocks, we put them in fences. And so you have someone that's breaking through for them. So the breaker has come up before them, and then they have broken up and have passed through the gate and are gone out by it, and their king shall pass before them. So the king's actually passing before them, and Yahweh's at his head. So Yahweh's at the head of this king who's passing before them as this breaking is going on, that's allowing them to pass through the gate. Now Yahweh is often associated, and the Moshiach in particular, as a shepherd. So a shepherd takes his flock into his area, his territory, his fence, his gate, right? So it's not like he's just setting them all free and sending them to run wild. These are sheep that's bringing into his fold. Okay. And so there's a breaking going on. Ephesians 2:14 through 15 says this. It says, "For he is our peace who hath made both one, and hath broken down," in the Greek side that's luso, "the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances," which is dogmasin, "for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace." This reference in Ephesians is about Yeshua, and it's about what? Him breaking down. He's breaking down a wall. What is Ephesians alluding to? It's alluding to Micah, which is drawn again association from Peretz as identifying the Mashiach as the breaker. So, it's one of the things that I really like to do. I call it deconstructing the New Testament. It's taking apart the New Testament, the elements of it, and showing where they come from. So when Paul writes something, it's really helpful to know what the heck he's drawing from when he's making the statements that he's making, because then you can understand the point of his statement. Rather than just reading, well, Paul said it and it's inspired, it's the Holy Ghost. So, but where did he draw it from? What's he getting at? If you don't understand these things, how can you understand what he's really saying? Okay. So there's some interesting things here. First, this word luso means to loosen, to untie or to unbind. So while we do take this, it can be in the sense of breaking down, we also have kind of this hint, this idea of loosening or unbinding. Before dealing with the next part, the middle wall of partition, we'll deal with that here in a little bit. I want to deal with this other word here. It says, abolished in his flesh the enmity. So it's very clear here. What was abolished in his flesh? The enmity. Now, some have taken this to say the law of commandments was abolished, but no, the text says it's the enmity that was abolished. Now, some could further argue, well, here, this King James, it says the enmity was abolished, even the law of commandments. So doesn't that mean that the law of commandments was really the enmity? Yes and no. Yes and no. We have to look at what's all being said here. And it says, having abolished in his flesh even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, which is dogmasin, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace. So there was an enmity between Jews and Gentiles. That's the core of the topic at hand. There was an enmity between them. And traditional Christian rendering will render this to be that the law and its ceremonial regulations was the enmity that separated Jews and Gentiles. But we know of no such separation explicitly spelled out in the Torah. But what we do know is that I think that was it the 17, so 18. I may quote this wrong. I should put it in here. The Gerzot, the fences enacted by Shammai prior to Yeshua taking on his ministry after the death of Hillel in around 10 AD, put specific fences in place that prohibited mingling of Jews and Gentiles. So about approximately 20 years before Yeshua's ministry fully coming into play, that there were fences put in place to separate Jews and Gentiles, such as we read in Acts, where Peter says it's not lawful for a Jew to enter the home of a Gentile. Now, obviously, that's nowhere found in the Tanakh, but we do understand that that was something put in place at that time, enactments of the court to forbid these relations. Right? So, when we look at this, one of the important words is dogmasin. It says the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Now, this word is not used all over the place, and this is one of the principal places it's used. And what is a dogma? Dogmasin is a Greek word, and here are some of the meanings. Something held as an established opinion, especially a definitive and authoritative. A code of such tenets, pedagogical dogma, a point of view or tenet put forth as authoritative without adequate grounds, a doctrine or body of doctrines concerning faith or morals formally stated in authority proclaimed by a church. So if we look principally at the core sets of meanings, particularly 1a and 1c, we find that a dogma at its core is essentially an opinion, an authoritative opinion, but an opinion. So having abolished even the law of commandments contained in opinions, for to make himself the twain one new man is making peace. Now, to call the law of God, the law of Moses, opinions would be a far stretch of the word. I mean, it was given by God. Was that just God's opinion? And is God's opinion not, by definition of his very nature, therefore fact and truth? Does God have opinions that are subjective, the way man has opinions that are subjective? I would not think so. So what we have here is we have a discussion of opinions, authoritative opinions, those were being abolished. Those caused enmity, and they separated Jew and Gentile. Here we have some further stuff on dogma. Again, this comes from a Greek lexicon, and what's it say? An opinion, a public decree. It's an opinion. A decree, edict, ordinance, or ordinance, an opinion. Again, opinion. Did I stress that enough? One of the things even here, with dealing with Judaism, and this is going to go into some more to talk about, when it comes to even the Talmud, there's such an ignorance about the Talmud, even amongst those that have some education on the topic, is outside of the core of it in the Mishnah, a large chunk of the Talmud is actually just a bunch of opinions that aren't really authoritative. They're not really binding. They're just opinions, okay? So even though we talk about them in Judaism, they're called halacha, they're called Jewish law, strictly it's not enforceable law, it's just opinions, and most of it's commentary on commentary, okay? Again, I'll probably come back to that point. So again, at its core here, what is being said? We're talking about dogmas or opinions of the law that were set down, and that was what's being abolished. Here, this is Ephesians 2:15 in Aramaic. There it is in script. Here it is in block. Below here is a slight. I added these brackets here to point out specific Aramaic words. This is actually John Wesley's Etheridge's translation. So, to further make my point, I want to focus on these right here. I can't read script too well, but I can fairly well read the Aramaic block letters, okay? So what you'll find here is you'll find Pei, Kof, Dalet, right? That's what these letters are. You'll find Pei, Kof, Dalet. So the root of these two words right here is the same. It's the same word. They're just slightly different. So these words in Aramaic are repeated twice, slightly different. And they're done that way to make a point. I'm going to show you in just a second. And it says here in Ephesians 2:15, it says, the enmity through his flesh and the law of prescriptions, that's this one right here. It's di pakude. That's what, right here. Di pakude. Okay, that's my rough Aramaic there for you. With its requirements. Now, the next word is not, see all these words here that are used to be trained? That's one word. There's a lot of words being used to translate one word. And that one word is pukudanawi. So it's pukudanawi. Pukude and pukudanawi. Okay. He hath abolished that of the two, that he might create in himself one new man and make peace. So this right here is Dalet in front of this Pakude. So it's D Pakude. This Dalet here is a prefix, which means of, which, who, that. And the bet here of the second word, this is the Hebrew letter bet, prefix, can mean in, among, or with. And this is the root word here, Pakudan, which means to command, decree, precept. So at its core, the word command is repeated twice, but it's modified, okay? So the first one is kind of like the law of commandments in commandments. The law of commandments in commandments. The idea is that it's talking about two sets of commandments. Okay, the first one being the law of commandments, which is God's commandments, and then the commandments of the commandments, which are enactments of the rabbis. You wouldn't talk about God's commandments this way. God's commandments are just his commandments. They're just his mitzvot. These are the commandments of the commandments. That's why in the Greek, the way they translated it is the word dogma, which again is the opinions or commandments of commandments. And Aramaic handles this really well by illustrating it this way. So before I go back, one of the key things here, why I point this out, and hang on. Yeah, let me just... Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly add another slide here just for... to kind of make my points here a little bit more clear. I'll give an example. Okay, so part of what we're dealing with here is there's an issue at the core of our faith. And it's a very difficult issue. And it is the whole notion of where the Jews fit in, the whole idea of oral law, and so on and so forth. And the issue is essentially that at least on the Messianic Jewish or Hebrew roots, and many people come to this point where they realize there are two Torah, one written and one oral. And so one of the first conclusions people make, especially if they don't have all the information at hand, is that, well, Jesus obviously against the oral Torah, and that he's for the Torah but not the oral Torah, and so we really need to throw that out. And that's why a lot of people sometimes are attracted to the whole notion of Karaites or charism, because charism promotes itself as Judaism without an oral law, even though that's not true. And in other places I talk about how that's not even functional to try and have the Torah without an oral exposition. But again, when we deal with the Talmud and it being a representation of the oral law, and that, what is the commandments of commandments that Yeshua did away with? Obviously, it's the oral law. Well, no, it says the enmity from the commandments of commandments. Essentially, there were commandments of commandments that separated Jews and Gentiles, and being that the prophets foretold that the Gentiles would flock to Moshiach, if Moshiach came and manifested himself, that would mean that you have to have some kind of commingling here. It has to put an end to that, right? And these are the things that Paul is trying to illustrate in his issue, is he's trying to allow the Gentiles to be able to enter the community instead of being forced apart from the community. And that if Yeshua is the Mashiach, that's part of his mission, and to keep that separation is to thwart that mission. And so when Yeshua came as the breaker, right, he even says, I have sheep not of this fold, right? So in order to do this, he has to break these fences. That's part of his deal, is breaking down fences that create separation. Why? Because the core of the Torah is for all. And if these fences kept some people out of God's kingdom, if they kept some people out of his righteousness, if they kept some people out of his ways, somebody has to do something about it. Somebody has to break through that, right? And that is part of the core of the Mashiach. He is not to dismantle all oral law. If he did, we'd have no Mashiach. Again, that's a bit much for some people to accept, but especially because of this. So, on the theme of Hanukkah, I was dealing with somebody online a little bit, and who was antagonistic against Hanukkah because it's from the Talmud. And I had just made a simple statement that not just because something's in the Talmud doesn't make it bad. And their counterpoint was the Talmud sanctions pedophilia. And this is from the Talmud, which I'm about to read to you. Again, it says, a Brisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, which is a first century Tanaim, Jewish sage, says a female who converted to Judaism below the age of 3 years and 1 day is permissible to a Kohen. As the verse states, but all the female children that have not known relations with a man, keep them alive for yourselves. So here, this is pretty clear, right? It says, no. Nowhere does it say sleep with them. Nowhere does it say anything except for in the last statement, the children that have not known relations with a man, keep them alive for yourself. So it means that you can marry them. Keep them alive, you can marry them. That's what it's stating. And the issue is, listen to what it says, a female who converted to Judaism. If this was endorsing pedophilia, then at its core you'd have to say it was endorsing pedophilia only to converts, because the topic at hand is a female who converted to Judaism. Now listen to also what it says. It says below the age of 3 years and 1 day is permissible to a Kohen. A Kohen cannot just marry anybody. A Kohen can only marry a virgin. So this is saying that a child convert to Judaism who converted below the age of 3 would be permissible to marry a Kohen. One who converted afterwards would not necessarily be permitted to marry a Kohen. Listen, on account of, but all the children that have not known relations. So in other words, if a child was older than 3 years and 1 day and had known relations, this child would no longer be considered a virgin and not able to marry a Kohen. It's not saying it's okay for that child because this child was a convert. So it's prior to the conversion, meaning if you heathens, something in your heathen world caused this child of older than 3 years and 1 day to have known a man, which should not happen. It's not endorsing that. This child would no longer be considered a virgin and able to marry a Kohen, only if something like that happened prior to that period or not known at all. This is actually a statement in the Talmud is to identify Jewish virginity of a convert, to identify that they're permissible or not to marry a Kohen. And it's just dealing with a legal aspect and legal technicality, because at some point, as absurd as some may seem, you have to answer the question. This child is a convert. They're now a grown woman, 16, 18, 20. She was not naturally born Jewish. Does she qualify? Can she marry a Kohen? That's the question. That's the question we're trying to answer. We have to figure out. At some point, you have to make a decision. Well, she came from the heathen world. She maybe grew up in a pagan temple where there were cultic prostitution. Things that ought not happen. And so we have to answer a question. What? Well, that seems absurd. Well, it seems absurd to you, but this is a serious matter that where this Cohen is he going to do the right thing or is he not? Can he marry this woman or can he not? So at some point we have to make a decision. This could say 6 years in 1 day. It could say 10 years in 1 day. For whatever reason, 3 years in 1 day is what was used. It's not saying pedophilia is okay. In fact, it's implying the opposite. It's just identifying about the age of conversion and what may have happened before or after that age and whether that child would be permissible to a Kohen. So if a child converted before 3 years and 1 day, regardless of whatever may have happened in that child's life, from that point on, we reckon if she remained a virgin up till her marriage, she could marry a Kohen. That's what this is trying to answer. Does it make sense? Can you read it from the text, what I'm saying? It's so irritating to me when statements in the Talmud are taken out of context and then used as attacks. Even if this was talking about the age of which intercourse was permissible, which it is not, that doesn't mean that there's an endorsement. There's actually other segments in the Talmud, which I don't have them here, which forbid pedophilia and so on, and that deal with this topic. That's not even the topic at hand. This is not the topic of when intercourse is allowed. The topic is whether a convert or not is permissible to marry a Kohen. Pretty straightforward. But again, people see these things and they attack these things, and you see, this is exactly what Yeshua was dealing with. These dirty Jews and their pedophilia, and he was abolishing because he's against that crap, and he's against their Hanukkah, and he's against all these things, right? Wrong. You don't even understand the text. And in fact, if you don't talk to the people who which the text originates, how do you know you're understanding it correctly? And the core of it is, whether people like it or not, there is a sanction of oral law. I'm going to do 2 verses here, and then I'm going to kind of go into a couple more things here real quick. One second, I messed something up. Deuteronomy 17, 8, and 9 is where I'm going to go. Deuteronomy 17, 8, and 9 says this: If there arise a matter for you too hard for thee in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, between matter of controversy within thy gates, thou shalt arise and get thee up into the place which Yahweh thy Elohim, or Yahweh thy God, the Lord thy God, shall choose. So when you have a matter like this, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the place where you shall choose. He says the same thing for sacrifices. Where do we know where that place was? Jerusalem. That's what it says. And you shall come unto the priests, the Levites, and unto the judge, Shoftim, which could be a rabbi, that shall be in those days, and inquire, and they shall show thee the sentence of judgment. And then we can even go further, down to 10. And thou shalt do according to the sentence which they of that place which Yahweh shall choose shall show thee, and shall observe to do according to all that they inform thee. Well, wait a minute. Why doesn't it say open your Bible and read what it says and just do what it says? It doesn't say that. It says if you have a matter, if you have something in this text that you don't understand, or if you have something in this text you don't know how to apply, that the elders in Jerusalem and the priests and the Levites can set the interpretation for how to apply it, and you have to do what they say. That's what it says. Doesn't say in Rome. Doesn't say go ask the Pope. It doesn't say do whatever you want. It doesn't say do whatever seems good to you. It doesn't say pray to me and I'll give you the answer even. It doesn't say open the scroll. It says these people have the right to create the sentence for what to do, and that we have to follow. There's another verse. Exodus 34:27. It says, and Yahweh said to Moses, write these words, after the tenor of these words I have made a covenant with thee and with Israel. What the heck does that mean? Tenor of these words. After the tenor of these words. Write thou these words, for after the tenor of these words I have made a covenant with thee, with Israel. As I talked a lot briefly, many people come to the understanding there are two Torah. We call the first one Torah Shabbat. That means the written Torah. The other one we call Torah Shabbal, which means Torah of the mouth. Okay, means oral Torah. Accordingly, which came first? Would you believe oral Torah? It says, and Yahweh said unto Moses, write these words, write the Shabbat, right? You're going to write the written Torah after the tenor of these words. Interesting. Will it surprise you? What the heck is tenor? I think like musical, you know. Papa sing bass, Mama sing tenor. Yeah, that's what I think, right? Let's see. Okay. So here it is. Et Hadebarim, these words, right? It's Hallel, which is these, key, right? Al-Pei, Hadebar. What do we call it, oral Torah? Oral Torah? Torah Shabbal Pei, Shabbai Al-Pei, shell of Al-Pei, the mouth, Al-Pei, Dabarim, right? Write these words after the Al-Pei, after the mouth. This is the word for oral Torah. God gave the Torah orally, and Moses wrote it down. And so we have this notion that this is one of the proof texts in Judaism where they say oral Torah is divinely sanctioned. Now, does that some misunderstand Judaism, and even some within Judaism stretch this point. This does not mean everything in the Talmud is divinely sanctioned. It only means things ruled by the courts before its destruction in Jerusalem were divinely sanctioned. And that doesn't mean that that court cannot be without error. The court could have obviously made error. In fact, the Torah prescribes things for when kings and when the people sin and how to do that. You know, the community can make bad decisions. And one of them, we understand, is the separation between Jews and Gentiles. There are other things that they've done. And so when we look through the lens of the oral law, these are the things that we really want to look at. What is actually divinely sanctioned or not? What is actually incumbent upon us to follow? What is mere opinions? Can we formulate our own opinions? Absolutely. And if they're really good opinions, maybe a future court would make them law. But for the time being, without refrigerators and without cars existing at the times. These things are beyond court decisions. And so when we approach these things, we need to, one of the things that separates the way I do things from a lot of other people, and there are others that kind of follow a similar train of thoughts and methods that I do, my approach is to understand my faith within Judaism. I understand that the scripture says that I've received a spirit of adoption. As earlier in Ephesians it reads, and I was brought near by the blood of Christ, right? Being both twain, being made one. So if I'm going to be adopted, I'm going to be brought in the house. I have a couple choices as an adopted child. I can approach this thing as I am not one of you. I'm adopted, I'm here, I'm not one of you. I'm in your house, I'm in your home, but I am not one of you. I don't belong here. Or you all do your thing, I will do mine. Or I can approach it from the place of saying, no, I'm within this home, I am now a part of you, and I need to learn and understand why you do what you do, how that relates to me, what does that mean for me? And that's really the approach that I recommend, rather than sitting on the outside and saying, I'm not going to cooperate with you, my adopted brothers, and my adopted family, because you're different. I'm not one of you, really. Or you can embrace that adoption and say, I'm one of you, and I'm not ashamed. And these are the issues that we face. So back to that topic in Ephesians. This comes from Tim Higg. If I would have had more time, I would have put some stuff on this topic together myself, but he did a pretty good job talking about this. And so he's talking about the dividing wall here. And he says, but what is the dividing wall? The mesotoiko, or mesotoikos, is found only here in the apostolic writings. It does not appear in the LXX. In other words, the word for the dividing wall, mesotoiko, only appears in the New Testament in this place, and it doesn't appear in the Septuagint. So further definition must be sought outside the biblical text to understand what the apostle is saying. The word has been found in two inscriptions in the sense of partition or barrier. The genitive tau, phragmao, or phragmao, is oppositional, the barrier consisting of the fence. Phragmao, or phragmos, fence, is found 3 other times in the apostolic writings, all with the sense of fence. The LLX, or LXX, sorry, the Septuagint uses the term with the same meaning. Note in Sirach, that's extra biblical writing, in 36:25, it says, there is no hedge, a vineyard is plundered, where there is no wife, a man wanders about in misery. In other words, it uses that word phragmao for a fence or hedge. Why it's relevant, I'll dive back to Ephesians here, and I will show you. Thus says middle wall of partition. These are the words that Higg is talking about. Mesotikon. And the other word being phragmao. So they're saying this word here doesn't necessarily have to be middle wall. It just means, really at its core, it means in the midst, among, kind of like in between. Okay, so it doesn't have to be middle wall, it's just middle and in between of the phragmao. Oh, I lost it. Which means hedge, partition, or fence. So many people, when they read this, they think they're talking about the middle wall, that the wall of the Gentiles that was added during Herod's reign, where it's really talking about he hath broken down or loosed the middle of the fence that was between us, right? He removed a portion of the fence. Remember Micah, it says, and he break forth and they'll go through the gate. there's a fence that's in front of the gate that's stopping them from going through. So a portion of that fence is removed to create an opening, a gate. So this is what Haig is pointing out. He says, some commentators have assumed the barrier spoken of in our text is the wall which separated the Gentiles and Jewish court and the temple. It is true that Josephus uses the phrase mesotoko, middle wall, to describe the inner wall of the temple, but the balustrade preventing Gentiles and the unclean Israelites from proceeding into the court of the Jews was never so designated, nor is it labeled phragmos by ancient writers. Furthermore, in the description engraved on the balustrade itself, the wall is referred to by a different term. No foreigner is to enter with the forecourt in the balustrade, and there is the Greek word here that was used for that. Around the sanctuary, whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death. Haig further writes, if Paul had intended his readers to understand the retaining wall of the temple which separated Gentiles from Jews to be what Messiah destroyed, he would have used the common Greek term, something he doubtlessly had seen time and time again as he entered the temple. Josephus calls the separation wall in the temple court de fruvavko liquivno, right? Hence, fence of stone, employing the term used in the inscription, and describes the wall as 3 cubits high with gates. Philo also calls the wall the same name and does not use mesotokoin phragmo, the words of our text. The Mishnah and Bavli refer to the balustrade by the term latticework of fence. As Barth writes in Ephesians 2:14, one of the technical names of the temple wall, as mentioned earlier, had been used, then it would be certain that the balustrade or the higher wall was meant. But Paul uses a Greek formulation, right, mesotokoin tau phragma, which he suggests is that imagery may be taken from someplace else. Important to our study is the fact that the verb there mentioned, I'm not going to try to pronounce that right now, to fence about, the verbal related to phragma, or wall, Ephesians 2:14, is also found in the epistle of Aristeas to refer to the oral Torah as the fence around the law, which effect separates between Jew and non-Jew. Our lawgiver fenced us about with impenetrable palisades and with walls of iron. To that end we should mingle in no way with any other nations, remaining pure in body and spirit, and so that we should be polluted by nor be infected with perversity by association with worthless persons. He has fenced us about, and the related word is used twice here for the same thing, on all sides. Prescribed purifications in matter of food and drink, and touch and hearing and sight. Okay? So in other words, there's contemporary Jewish writings that use a similar word that Paul uses, implying that that would more likely be his source. Now before going forward, the gist of it is, even if we're talking about the middle wall in the temple here, that's still not the law. That was not prescribed by the Torah. Again, that was added by Herod and those builders. But here we find in the rabbinic injunction regarding a fence around the law is common, as in Aboth or Perki Avot. They said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, again that's from the Talmud, and make a fence around the law. And Akiba said, jesting and levity habituate a man to lewdness. The tradition is offense to the law. Tithes are offense to riches. Vows are offense to abstinence. Offenses to wisdom is silence. Furthermore, we have in the Qumran covenants referred to rabbinic interpreters of the Torah by the name builders of the wall. As far as they were concerned, God had turned his anger toward these builders because of his hatred for the builders of his wall. His anger was kindled. The Qumran sect are basically the Essenes. They're a first century sect of Judaism, and they often interpreted many rabbinic writers many of the rabbinic groups in their time as builders of the wall. Why? Because they are in a way descendant, or they claim their descendancy from the men of the Great Assembly, the people like Ezra and Nehemiah who actually built the wall. So when they came and rebuilt the temple from that from the schools of Ezra and such is where we get the rabbis, where they came from. And the prophets talked about those, the builders of the wall, the builders are rejected. In fact, we just read a little bit about this stone in Zechariah in the Haftarah portion, where it talks about the stone with 7 eyes, right? And we read about the Mashiach, and it says about the Mashiach, and I will put my spirit upon him, right? The spirit of wisdom, the spirit of fear of God. It mentions 7 spirits. And it talks about that they're going to say to the stone, grace, grace. And the stone is related to removing the, in context of removing the sin of the land in one day. All these things we associate with the Mashiach, and we associate with Yeshua being the stone the builders rejected. That doesn't mean he rejected them. They rejected him. Now, he does say that, again, that their blood would be upon them, those that judged wrongly, and rightly so. When the leaders of the people, according to the Torah, when the leaders of the people judge wrongly for the people and lead the people to err, they are the ones that bear the judgment. All these things fall within the realm of understanding of the Torah. None of this is saying that we throw out oral interpretation. So Haig continues. He says, from these brief notes we may surmise, first, the wall spoken of by Paul in Ephesians 2:14 was not the dividing wall in the second temple because A, it was still standing at the time Paul wrote in Ephesians, so it wasn't torn down. And B, the terminology Paul uses to describe the wall is different from the terms used for the dividing wall in the temple. The terms Paul no doubt was familiar with. Secondly, the Greek term phragmos was used in the first century to identify the oral Torah as a wall or fence around the written Torah and the Pharisees as builders of the wall. Thirdly, aspects of the oral Torah, not the written Torah, laid the foundation for strict separation between Jew and non-Jew. Okay. So this is kind of going somewhere. It is leading back to Matthew. So halakha, or Jewish law, especially the Talmud tractate Shabbat, identifies 39 categories of activity prohibited on Shabbat and clarifies many questions surrounding the application of biblical prohibitions. Many of these activities are also prohibited on the Jewish holidays listed in the Torah, although there are significant exceptions permitting carrying and preparing food under specific circumstances. Further, we find on malaka, and this is the word for work, halakha Jewish law, especially the Talmud tractate Shabbat, identifies 39 categories of activity prohibited on Shabbat, or what we call avot malaka, and clarifies many questions surrounding the application of biblical prohibitions. Many of these activities are also prohibited on the Jewish holidays listed in the Torah, although there are significant exceptions permitting carrying and preparing food under specific circumstances. The 39 malaka are not so much activities as categories of activity. For example, while winnowing usually refers exclusively to the separation of chaff and grain, it refers in the Talmudic sense to any sense of separation of intermixed materials which renders edible that which was inedible. Thus, filtering undrinkable water to make it drinkable falls under this category, as picking small bones from a fish. Many rabbinic scholars have pointed out that these regulations of labor have something in common. They prohibited any activity that is creative or that exercises control or dominion over one's environment. The definitions presented in this article are only headings for in-depth topics, and without study of relevant laws, it would be very difficult, perhaps impossible, to properly keep the Sabbath according to halakha, Jewish law. In other words, there were 39 categories of activity which we identify as prohibited on Shabbat. One of these is winnowing. Now the rabbis, again, in the whole pursuit of fences to help protect profaning of Shabbat, added or made certain regulations very strict. It's not that potentially winnowing isn't forbidden for Shabbat. The question is, what is winnowing and what isn't? Now, one of the things in the Talmud, they talk as far as winnowing would be taking grains and rubbing it between your fingers and eating it. Okay, so if you walked by a wheat field of wheat, and you took the wheat off and you rubbed it to get at the grains, and then ate it, that would be considered winnowing. Matthew 12, 1 through 8, right? Greater than the temple is to be greater than the priest. We're back here. It says, at that time Yeshua went on Shabbat through the corn, and that is not necessarily corn, it's just the way King James or many other translations translate. It could be wheat. The implication is that it was wheat. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck ears of corn and to eat, right? Whether we're talking about ears of corn or we're talking about wheat, the idea of winnowing, according to the rabbinic definition, would be the same, because you have to shuck ears of corn, you'd have to rub the wheat to get to the fruit. It says, but when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do on Shabbat. But he said unto them, have you not read what David did, and when he was hungry, and they that were with him, he entered into the house of God, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the Torah how the Shabbat, the priests in the temple profane Shabbat and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if you would have known what this meaning, I have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of Shabbat. Hopefully, by the end of what I'm done here, which will be pretty shortly, this segment of Scripture will make a lot more sense to you. So the issue here is Yeshua and his disciples were hungry, and it was Shabbat, and they winnowed according to rabbinic prohibition. Now remember, he is what we'd call the breaker, the one that's broke up, not only just breaking the idea of separation for Jews and Gentiles, the heart of even allowing the Gentiles to come in, the heart of his breaking is to remove those things that even create separation between man and God, extraneous burdens, as he talks about in other places, right? The Pharisees bind up burdens grievous to be borne. So, it says, when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon Shabbat. But he said unto them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and they were with him? So he doesn't say, first off, his issue here is he doesn't just start railing at them, saying about your vain traditions and your doctrines of men or anything. He counters them with Scripture. He says, well, wait a minute. Have you not read about what David did when he was hungry and they were that with him? How they entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for them to eat, nor were his companions. So David did this thing that was transgression, but David wasn't held as a transgressor. So that's point A. David did something similar to what you're accusing me of, and not exactly the same, but similar enough context, and he was blameless. Point 2, or have you not read in the Torah how that on Shabbat the priests of the temple profane Shabbat and are blameless? In other words, the priests in the temple on Shabbat, they conduct sacrifices, they conduct work, they do things. God doesn't hold them guilty. Then he says, but I say unto you, in this place is one greater than the temple. And by implication of being greater than the temple, it's being greater than the priests. In other words, if the priests can do their work on the temple and they're rendering that that's okay, because if they didn't believe it was okay, they wouldn't do it. And that's okay that they make that they interpret it that way, right? Because the Torah indicates that they should. One greater than the temple is standing here before you. Now, who was David? David was king. Yeshua is identifying David's ability as king to interpret the Torah and its application. In other words, David made it an interpretation of the Torah that this was acceptable based on the conditions at hand, and as king, he could do that. He's not denying the Torah. He's saying, I have an issue of law here. Is what I'm about to do acceptable or not? I have to make a decision. And as king, he's able to do that. The king is not changing the Torah. He's saying, in these circumstances, how do I deal with this? Much in the same way that you have a speed limit, 60 miles an hour. Someone goes 70 miles an hour, a policeman's on the same road. If the policeman goes 70 or 75 miles an hour to catch this person, is he not too breaking the law? He's speeding now too. But we render the policeman just in what he's doing based on the situation. Ordinarily, that should be speeding, but in this instance, it's not. Just like in the instance of with the showbread, that would have ordinarily been improper, but in this instance, it was proper. And such is the same here that Yeshua is saying. In other words, Yeshua is accusing them for judging them before understanding. They called him right out. They said, "You're doing what's not lawful." Instead of asking, "Why are you doing what you're doing?" or "Is what you're doing lawful?" They were rendering guilt. And this is what he says here: "If you had not known the meaning, I have mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless, for even the Son of Man is Lord of Shabbat." In other words, he's saying even the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Just like King David, if King David as king could make an interpretation of law that was accurate, I can too. Mashiach, the core is Mashiach can too. This isn't a transgression. It might be a transgression based on your definition, but based on the circumstance, this is acceptable. Even more so, when you look at it, the context here comes from Hosea, maybe Hosea chapter 6, I think. Yeah, Hosea 6:6. And then I'm about to close here. It says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." Okay, he said, if you understood what this means, you would not have called me guilty. Here again, it's talking about, it says, "For thou have hewn them by the prophets, and have slain them by the words of my mouth, and thy judgments are as the light that goeth forth." In other words, you have, during Hosea's day, you're having a lot of issues with corruption, unjust measures, so on and so forth. That's why the northern kingdom gets exiled, and Judah follows suit. And God is saying here, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." Okay? So at its core, what are we talking about mercy? We're talking about hesed, love and kindness. We desire love and kindness. That's what we're talking about with mercy. In other words, Yeshua's rebuking them and saying, look, you come here, you see what we're doing, and basically demanding a sacrifice. You're guilty. You transgressed Shabbat. You're wrong. You've sinned, right? Rather than coming for him and trying to understand the why first, showing love and kindness, assuming the good before making the judgment, right? It's talking about an even knowledge of God. If this verse was if Yeshua was talking about doing away with even commandments of God and rendering Sabbath as something inconsequential, this verse doesn't make sense, because one of the things it talks about is the knowledge of God. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings, right? And understanding God's heart and God's intent in a situation expressed through love and kindness, and not strictly just being judgmental or applying these things. And then Yeshua gives his interpretation of why he's doing what he's doing, and that's what is that? Matthew 6:12, 1 through 8. No. What did I just say? That doesn't make any sense. 12, 6, Matthew 12, 1 through 8. And so he makes that statement. And then going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. That's pretty much the end of the discussion. They didn't stone him. They didn't try and, bring judgment on it. He went in the synagogue. Did they get the elders and rile up the... No, he started healing people. Now, I mean, that's not the simple end of it. He goes on to continue to talk about Shabbat. And he begins to challenge certain rabbinic assertions about Shabbat and Shabbat's place and man's place in things. And he begins challenging things that they're saying, but he's not invalidating the idea that there's need for interpretation on these things. He's just challenging some of their interpretations on these things. He's still working in an oral framework within the oral interpretation. He's just challenging certain interpretations of theirs that go against the heart of God, God's intent, the knowledge of God. What is God's purpose? What is God trying to do here? Is God trying to make people a slave to Shabbat, where Shabbat should be miserable? We're told that Shabbat is to be a delight, right? In particular for the ger, it's supposed to be for refreshing the soul accordingly. So if we look at Shabbat, and these people were traveling to synagogue, and they were hungry for the purpose of the joy and delight of Shabbat. Shabbat isn't a day for afflicting your souls. This isn't Yom Kippur, Shabbat of Shabbats, right? This isn't Yom Kippur where it's like they should be starving and no. It's okay. It's not like they harvested the whole field. They took a couple grains to sustain them so that they could enjoy the day, the delight. That was the heart of what Shabbat is for. And Yeshua goes on to continue to rebuke certain things where the people were becoming slave to the commandment rather than servants of the commandment, rather than servants of God. It's really the heart of it, is they were becoming servants of the dictates of certain rabbis and missing out on the heart and the real meaning and the real service to God. And while that's a slippery slope, that's the issue, and that's the issue we face when dealing with the Talmud, dealing with Judaism today, is how do we deal with these things? How do we understand them? How do we relate to them? How do we apply them? We don't throw everything out, but we do have to figure out, again, with or without the Talmud, we have to figure out how do we apply the Word of God in our life, right? And so the oral aspect gives us insight in how to apply it into our life in real and practical ways. And that's the purpose it's supposed to serve. But it can be used. It can be used as a tool to enslave. But so can just the Word of God in general, can be used as a tool to enslave. So I don't know if that came across as well as I wanted it to, but it's kind of the gist of it. As I see so much of that, especially on the Hebrew root side of things, where it's like the Jews are so screwed up. The Jews have it so wrong, and we're doing it so right because we're just following the written law, but you're not. You're not. And so, yeah, Jews do have some things screwed up. Sure, anybody does in different segments and different groups, and it's called humanity. Humanity is what screws things up. But if we're honest, we can see that God has kept them as a distinct people all this time, just like He promised according to His word. And so, as we deal with our faith and relate to our faith, we need to find the ways to do it with the minimal amount of conflict possible. That's my recommendation. It can't be free of conflict. It's not going to be free of conflict. But let's not make conflicts that are unnecessary or don't reach God's objective. God's objective is to make them into one. That's what Ephesians says, to make the twain into one. And yet I find even on the Christian side of things, it's like I'm a Christian and everybody's got to come my way. You Jews, you should celebrate Easter and have a pork chop. That's freedom you have in Messiah. And anything short of that is denial of the liberty Messiah has given to you. And it's like, no, I don't quite think so. I don't know, that's tangent, I guess. Anyway, I think with that